The Still Loading podcast is brought to you by the wonderful people on Patreon. Amazing people like Stephen P., Mr. Biscuits, Gilmer, Kevin from the Bit by Bit Foundation, Matt aka Stormageddon, Ryan K., and Eric H. have all been wonderful enough to support the show over there. So if you would also like to get your name read at the beginning of an episode, along with a bunch of other goodies, go over to patreon.com/stillloadingpod and check out everything it has to offer. On this episode of Still Loading, some things are just too much fun. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and today's episode, I have a very special interview prepared for you. I'm so excited to be talking with my guest who is here with me today. We are going to be talking about his recently released book. At the time this comes out, it'll be recently released. His recently released book, all about the Commodore 64. And joining me today to talk about his book and all things Commodore and 64 is Jesper Juul. Jesper, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
I'm so excited to speak to you, man. I've been really looking forward to this. I told you off mic, and I'm repeating it here. I really enjoyed your book called Too Much Fun, The 5 Lives of the Commodore 64 from the MIT Press. I've been really enjoying this. I really enjoyed reading this book, so I'm happy to finally get to speak to you.
Yeah, great. Looking forward to it.
So, to kick it off, my first question for you. It's a basic question, but I kind of got the answer from reading the book. But for my listeners who have not read this book, what inspired you to write this? This is a book all about the Commodore 64, a lot of its technical aspects, but also its cultural aspects and like what it contributed to the like game culture at large. So, what inspired you to write this book about this topic?
Well, I guess you could say so. I've written about video games for a while, and then I realized that in a way, I grew up, say, with the Commodore 64 and home computers in Northern Europe, right? But then I was reading all these kind of video game histories, which kind of rarely mentioned the Commodore 64 at all. And I realized that there was a bit of a kind of disconnect between my own experience and this kind of histories of video games you often read. And the same thing with computer histories, right? So the Commodore 60 was the main computer of my my youth, right? And it was say, like the school had a Commodore 64 lab and so on. So it was like the big kind of computer, the computer for the home. But computer histories didn't really mention it all that much either, right? So I realized that I kind of felt that there was really a lack of a kind of good book that tried to explain like what role this Commodore 64 really played and in like say like the games and the programs and the culture around it, because I feel that, so you might say in video game history, so there's the kind of standard US version of history which focuses on say Nintendo saving the market in the mid 1980s, right? And there's a standard kind of computer history which ends up often being about Apple and IBM, right? And it just seemed that was just a really central portion of both of those histories that just hadn't been written properly.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that as well. And one of the things that I was telling you off mic as well about how there are some things in this book that I had never thought about before, and one of them is the kind of centralization of computer history. Like I never really thought about how much we have, like especially US centric, it has boiled down computer history to just, well, Steve Jobs and Apple and Bill Gates and Microsoft, and maybe IBM is just coming up in the rear. And I had never really thought about it that way. And I really sat down to think about it while reading your book. I'm like, he's right. Like I never hear anything about compute like from those unless it's like someone who's really into computer history and had like a TI 99 4A or something like that. I think that's the the Texas Instruments one.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah.
yeah. Which, funny enough, my uncle had one of those, and I played it growing up. Uh, but even so, you never hear about that like at all. It's always Apple and Microsoft. And in terms of game history from like a U.S. perspective, I agree. I agree with you entirely on that as well. Where it feels like so much of it is so heavily focused on the US side of things. And like, did Nintendo save the game industry? Well, the console industry in the US, I can't say it would, it saved the world. And you
Mm,
reference it in the book too about how there is a major misconception online that the game market crash of 83 was a worldwide crash instead of just localized to
yeah.
North America. Um, so I
Yeah,
really enjoyed that perspective.
yeah, and even then, like just also that like there was a home computer industry in the U.S., a home computer game industry that kind of kept going, and wasn't particularly stopped by the console crash, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess one of the other questions I want to ask, it's tangentially connected to your book. It's, why do you think that maybe there is so much focus on the US side of game history? Is it just maybe that's like, content, is it content creator driven like YouTuber and stuff, or is it like, why do you think there is such a lack of coverage on things outside of the US and Japan in terms of game history?
well, well, I mean, it was true for a while that say the U.S. and Japan were the biggest sort of exporters of kind of video games, right? But
Hmm.
it's just also that it's a big country and has a certain kind of cultural influence around the world, right? So there are just certain stories that kept being retold, right? And then you got, say, like television specials about like the pirates of Silicon Valley, and it's a lot of that
Hmm.
history became kind of Hollywoodized kind of over time, right? And then I think also if you're a journalist, it's just always easier to start with this sort of default kind of story. So there was a crash, Nintendo saved everything, or like there was Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. It's just kind of easier to start with it because it's kind of personified, right? So I think
Hmm.
it's just sort of also just repetition, right? So it's a bit like this joke that nobody got fired for buying Microsoft, right? So nobody got fired for just repeating this kind of standard history about Nintendo or the standard history about Apple and Microsoft, right? Even though they have like a very obvious holes in them, right? So if you
Hmm.
read, say, John Romero's uh, book about making Doom, like he had a home computer, well, an Apple II in this case, right? He didn't start with a console, right? So a lot of this kind of game culture obviously comes from home computers, even in the US too, right? And I think that just gets kind of written out.
I, I I agree, and especially I feel like in the '80s, like gaming, PC or computer gaming, not necessarily PC, but computer gaming has very much been an overlooked aspect of game history. Like
Yeah.
it doesn't really start being spoken about a lot until you get to the '90s with, Doom and FPSs and RTS games and you name it, point and click adventures, that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I was curious about your perspective on it. So yeah, I guess it makes sense. That makes sense to me. Um, what I wanted to dive into now is to the book itself. It makes, like, we kind of touched on a little bit there, just like why this book is needed, because most of game history, as we just said, is so US centric. And so when you were writing this book to dive into the Commodore 64, not just with your supplementing your own experience with the system along with a bunch of others, what's something that surprised you while researching this book? Like, was there something that you came across that you weren't expecting to? Like, what was something that you discovered while doing your research?
Oh yeah. So I mean, there's been a kind of argument about that sort of game culture and computer culture was becoming separate during the 1980s, right? And you can sort of imagine this idea that like first people have home computers, then consoles and games come
Hmm.
along, and people stop, say, typing in programs from magazines, and eventually they just become sort of consumers of packaged software over time, and they start having consoles, and then at the same time you get the graphical user interface, right? So definitely there was a sense I had, and I think other people had too, was that during the 1980s and the early 90s, people just stopped programming their computers in a sense, right? But then
Hmm.
when I actually sat down and read some of the kind of bigger kind of game magazines, especially the UK one called SAP, and even also the German ones, also, or kind of US ones like Computes Cassette. It's actually
Hmm.
funny that people keep programming, and they, to some extent, they actually keep kind of programming more, right? So especially the German magazines have these kind of incredibly detailed things about machine language programming of various graphical tricks through the 80s and 90s, or early 90s. So that was actually the big surprise for me, right? That it was computer culture and game culture was kind of very closely tied together, right? And
Hmm.
also in the sense that you might say that there was certain. So I teach game design, right? So
Yeah.
that just certain game. A lot of the games that put out that came out during that time were too hard, right? Like they were like incredibly hard. I'm not even not
To
even
put it
like
mildly,
not
yeah.
even Nintendo hard. Like we're talking about something that's kind of worse than that, right? And
Yeah.
if students handed those games in, we would explain to them that this was wrong, right? That we wouldn't fail them, but we'd tell them that here's a serious flaw, right? But at the time, it was kind of understood that if games were too hard, there would be a poke, right, a cheat that you could either find yourself or type in from a magazine or use some kind of cheating cartridge, so you could actually play the game, right? And so you get infinite lives, so you could walk through monsters or something like that. And so that's also, I think, an example of how closely, say, like the programming and technical culture was to game playing culture during that time. And it's very clear when you see it in the magazines, actually.
Now, real quick for my listeners, you mentioned that there is a cheat or a poke. Could you describe for my listeners who may not know what that means? What is a poke in Commodore 64 terms?
Right. So poke is a command in the basic programming language that just changes a location in memory. So you have your program, your game loaded into memory, and let's say there might be some location in that memory where the number three is there because you have three lives, right? And then if you
Hmm.
you you you, you find that address, and then you say, let's say it's 15,211, then you start type poke 15,211, comma 200, right? And then you have 200 lives instead of three. So that was a probably kind of common.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so other variations might be there's a command that just decreases the number of lives when you're dead, and then you just remove that command with a poke, right? Or other ones where you say because the video chip kind of keeps track of when things collide with each other, and then you just take that, you find the reference to that address in the video chip, and then you just remove it, and then the game no longer registers when you're walking into a monster, and you can walk through things, right? So that was a that was a pretty common thing, and of course, if you could find pokes or you had a big library of pokes, you'd also be a popular kid on the block.
That is such an interesting thing where it's like, now if you were find a way to like cheat or something like that, most people would look down upon it. But back then, the way write about it in the book is like it was almost expected because the games were so
Hmm.
astronomically difficult that it's like, yeah, that's just what this is just what you do. And at the same time, it kind of rewarded people for tinkering with the code because so much of the you know it's so different from now where if you want to play a game on your computer now, like you don't really see the underlying code easily. You have to like know your way around things. Like I can't, if you ask me to like look at the code for like, I don't know, what's the game I recently installed, like Dishonored or something like
Hmm.
that, like I wouldn't know how to get to that. But like it on Commodore 64, like you had to have a lot more technical know-how just to operate the system. Am I correct with that like kind of
Yeah, I mean,
perception?
you could play games pretty easily. Just that wasn't too hard, right? But it's more like this idea of modifying the program was just kind of very. It was something people did, right? It was a common thing.
Hmm.
I mean, it was also easier. The programs were a lot smaller, right? So it has 64 kilobytes of RAM, and now today you can certainly have games that are. I was installing a game that I think was kind of 30 gigabytes, so that's kilo mega giga, so that's like 500,000 times larger, right? So that's of course it takes a longer time to go through all that code than just a tiny Commodore 64 program.
Hmm. Hmm. And one of the things that you brought up in the book too, just talking about like the differences between computer culture, like the computer aspect and the gaming aspect of the Commodore 64. There's a couple different things that you brought up that really surprised me. That one, back in the 70s, that there was a delineation or a different there's a difference between a home computer or like a computer and like a personal computer, where like
Yeah.
one was considered lesser because it was more game based and one was considered more professional and studious or whatnot. What was the different? What were the names too? I'm blanking on it now. I thought it was like personal computer and just computer, but I could be
Yeah,
misremembering.
usually like the kind of cheaper computers in the home were called home computers, and there was this idea that there was another kind of computer that was more serious, like the personal computer. And
Okay.
today, and today that is kind of that kind of delineation has kind of gone away, right? In the UK, the home computers were sometimes called microcomputers, right?
Mm.
But there was definitely a sense that a personal computer was more kind of serious, right? And I have a quote from John Scully from Apple, who explains that Apple is not making home computers, but computers for the home. And it's kind of, you have to pass it like what does that mean? Well, it just means that like home computer has this kind of taint he wants to avoid. That's a kind of unserious computer. Apple is obviously not making such kind of unserious devices, right? Even though people
Oh my
obviously play
god.
games on Apple computers too, right? But also
Mm.
remember that say like the IBM PC like didn't have color in the beginning, the Mac didn't have color in the beginning. The IBM PC didn't actually have these kind of facilities for kind of moving for scrolling or quickly moving graphics around. And I think that was kind of by design, right? That was not the kind of computer they wanted, right? And so today it's kind of obvious that a computer has to have, say, color and sound and can quickly move graphics around and so on. So and a phone
Hmm.
has that too. So today that's completely obvious that, but it was something that people were actively avoiding because it made computers sound like unserious, right?
It's just when I first read that, I literally started laughing out loud. I'm like, what? Did it not dawn on them and how ridiculous that sentence was? We don't make home computers. We make computers for the home. Uh, all right, you do you, man. You do you. That was so funny to me. Now to dive a little bit further into the book, I don't want to obviously cover every single thing that you talk about in the book because I want my listeners to go out and buy this. It was wonderful. The way you broke up this book is that you broke it up into a total of 6 chapters if you include the introduction.
Yeah.
But the five imaginaries of the Commodore 64. So for my listeners, how do you define what an imaginary is? Because I don't think I've seen anyone use that term in this context before. So for my listeners, when you say there's five imaginaries for the Commodore 64, or at least the five that you're speaking about here, how do you define imaginary?
Yeah, so imaginary is a concept from this kind of subfield called media archaeology, where people like to talk about, say, the history of a medium, say, the history of radio, the history of television, also the history of things that just never came to pass, too, right? And one of the points in the media archaeology is that, like, often you have an sort of an imagined idea of what the medium is before it comes to be, right? And then also then when say like you start having a television in the home or you start having a
Mm-hmm.
radio, then over time it may change your idea of what it is. So like if you were to suddenly point blank be asked to explain, say, what is a radio or what is a computer, you might not actually have the same explanation over time, right? And so the idea of the different imaginaries for the Commodore 64 is that when it was first launched, Commodore very clearly tried to lean into it as being a serious computer, right? So
Mm-hmm.
so on the kind of US and European box, there are no video games, right? It's much more it's people who are studying and they're at work and are perhaps doing their accounts or things like this, right? So the first imaginary, like when it was launched, was that this computer, this thing, is a serious computer where you can learn about programming, obviously, but you can also do all kinds of office work and so on, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then quickly, I think when pretty quickly it switched to being seen as a game computer, and as we talked about, that's kind of was considered a somewhat negative thing sometimes. Then people knew that what is a Commodore 64? Well, it's a computer for all these kind of great games, and has like
Hmm.
wonderful graphics and wonderful sound, and the games are even free, perhaps, right? People shouldn't copy them. And then the third life is a more kind of this kind of underground culture. I talked about this whole idea of the demo scene where people were making, including myself, were making these kind of demonstration programs showing off your technical skills and meeting and competing about them, and also this whole idea of kind of cracking games and removing software protection. So in the third life, then what is a Commodore 64? It's really this kind of awesome device that gives you access to this kind of interesting, somewhat subversive culture, right?
Hmm.
And then the fourth life is then like when the platform starts feeling kind of old, which happens in the US a little before it happens in Europe. Where and then you get then say like the Amiga has a new game, say like Defender of the Crown or Lemmings, and
Hmm.
then people are then anxiously awaiting whether there'll be like a Commodore 64 version of the game and how good it's going to be, right? And so then the reviews will say, oh, all right, so it's not as good as the Amiga version, but it's surprisingly good, right? So at this point, there's this kind of feeling that the machine is kind of trying to sort of keep up with newer machines, and this is also where you got something like GEOS, which was a graphical user interface for the Commodore 64, right?
Hmm.
Because newer computers have graphical user interfaces.
And
And the
real
fifth
quick,
life, sorry, go
I
ahead.
was just going to say real quick for my listeners, just because I don't. I think without understanding what a GUI or a graphical
Oh yeah,
user interface is, just for those who don't know, it's basically what you use to operate computers now. Like on the Commodore 64 and back then, you would literally have to type in commands into essentially what the command prompt is now.
yeah.
Uh, and with now, we like all computers are run off of GUIs. It's your Windows bar, it's your file browser, it's your Internet Explorer. It's like all the windows that you use to actually to command the computer what to do instead of having to type in commands. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just
No,
wanted to
no, no.
give
Yeah, yeah,
listeners some context for it.
and your phone too, obviously, right? So
Hmm.
you don't have any phones with command line interfaces.
No.
You could have one, like you'd have to type a command to call someone. I don't think it exists. You could theoretically have it, right? But then the fifth life is one where when then the computer becomes kind of sufficiently old that it becomes sort of a bit more like a retro device, which is like
Hmm.
where we are now. Then people today will make games. So like say in this kind of in the previous one where I talked about the people wanted some Commodore 64 to keep up, then programmers were doing everything they could to sort of hide the limitations of the Commodore 64 and to make sure the graphics didn't look too chunky or whatever, right? And but now I think we're in this different phase where it's more like the Commodore 64 has this kind of cool retro style. So people actually make games that where the graphics are even more chunky than they are
Hmm.
usually, and then the kind of graphical limitations of the Commodore 64 are things that you actually kind of celebrate now, right? You like the big pixels and some of the chunky graphics and the limitations. So those are suddenly kind of super interesting, right? And so that's what happens, right, when you get to this point where, say, nobody is anxious that the Commodore 64 is slower than a new computer. You
Hmm.
know this, right?
It's part of the
But
charm now.
yeah, now yeah, it's a charm, right? So I think that's to me what's interesting, realizing there's a kind of shift. Perhaps I don't know if it's at 20 years or something that then you get this shift from being worrying that your computer is falling behind to kind of celebrating its kind of old kind of quirky features, right? And
Yeah, and that's one of the things I really enjoyed about your book, just like kind of taking a look at technology through the lens of these imaginaries. Like, and if you want to like look at something that's current, I would say the Nintendo Switch is currently in like your fourth imaginary where
yeah,
it's trying to keep up, right? It's trying to it's on that ever long quest to be like, no, I'm not using like really old hardware on this, and just is trying to keep going. But that's kind of where it is. I find that kind of interesting, and you reference also in like chapter 5 in the Eternal Style how like not just things with Commodore like this, but like why do indie game devs make things to look like they're from the
Yeah.
NES or Super Nintendo or stuff like that? Because now it's a style. It's the limitation is a style itself. Um, were there
Yeah.
any other imaginaries that you were able to find for this that you did not talk about in the book? Like, are there more than these five that you found, or were these the five that you kind of or were these the only five? I should say.
I think those kind of felt the strongest. So when you do something like this, it's a bit of a question of kind of structuring history in a way that feels kind of both kind of clear and memorable, right? So
Hmm.
other people have had these ideas with these kind of three phases or something, but I think then they definitely lack the kind of present state where yeah, it has just a kind of a nice style that we enjoy, right? So that I think five kind of felt like kind of the appropriate one. You might say that of course people also do other things with it, right? So um, for some people, the Commodore 64 did become the kind of center for various kind of electronics projects, for example.
Hmm.
And I'm not really talking all that much about that. I was just communicating with someone whose father still uses the Commodore 64 for his ham radio. so so that's also a thing, but I didn't feel it was strong enough to be kind of big imaginary in that sense, right? But
Mm.
there is actually a funny thing about the Commodore 64, which I think people don't really appreciate, which is that Commodore were the ones who were making these kind of super slick kind of devices that you weren't meant to open, right? And other companies like IBM and Apple and Radio Shack were making these computers where you're supposed to open them and put in a kind of new cards to get sound or whatever, right? But Commodore were actually making these kind of closed boxes where you had like an interface, a bit like a USB for connecting external
Hmm.
devices, right? So they were a lot like what Apple is now, actually. But then over time, the Commodore 64 has become the thing that people take apart and do electronics projects for.
That makes sense then. Yeah, because I wasn't sure if there was any extra ones like kind of on the cutting room floor, but I based off your book, like I honestly couldn't think of any others. Not that like I would know any, of course. It's just more like just it seemed like you covered so many aspects of the history of the system or of the computer and whatnot. Um, a couple things I wanted to like I took down some notes while reading just some things that I found like particularly interesting. Some of them are like really innocuous but still like amusing to me. Like holy crap, Commodore's factory is based out of Westchester, PA. That's like
Yeah,
I live near Philadelphia, so when I see that I'm like, "Oh, that's like my area sort of." Like I live far away ish. Like it's a drive for me to get to Westchester, but like it's still it was kind of cool to see. I'm like, oh wow, it was literally like right in my backyard. Basically, I even Googled it afterwards just to see. I'm like, what like is who is taking up that space now? And it's like some like marketing company or something like that. So I thought that was kind of amusing.
yeah.
Um,
I realized that. I thought it was when you just mentioned you were in Pennsylvania. I thought that was kind of appropriate, right?
yeah.
There are these kind of Facebook groups. There's a specific Facebook group for Commodore history, and then people like post videos where they go to the kind of original location and film themselves.
Wow, that's kind of funny. That's really cool though. I love that there's still so much um passion for this that like it's going it like the people will travel to a building that's not even occupied by the company anymore. Excuse me, just so they can go and see it.
But I
Uh
think, actually, but there's a point there about, say, especially American computer history, which is that like a lot of early computer companies were on the East Coast, right? There's this whole idea of Route 128 in Massachusetts being central to early computer history, right? And then even something
mm,
like the Computer History Museum was originally in Boston, but now
oh
that's moved. Now that's in California. So there was also I think a generally kind of East Coast West Coast thing where the East Coast part of that history has been kind of forgotten a little, right?
I never. It's so much so that they moved the Museum of Computer History from the East Coast to the West Coast, kind of like further cementing the whole everything is stemmed from Silicon Valley type of
Yeah,
history.
yeah. I
You
mean,
might.
it's a good museum, right? So, but it's more like I think due to various factors, they ended up moving west, right?
Okay, okay. Um, in chapter 2, for when you were talking about the game machine, like the Commodore as a game machine, and you referenced some of the stuff that's going to be talked about in chapter 3, that there was actual police raids for cracking parties.
Yeah, yeah,
That's I'm just picturing, because whenever you think of a police raid, you have this connotation in your head, like it's a drug bust, or there's like maybe there's just some, I don't know, militia
Mhm.
thing, but no, it's just a bunch of teenagers pirating software, and that
Yeah,
that that
yeah, yeah,
prompted a police raid. It's just the visual in my head. It's just so silly to me, but I get it. Like it's a like you talk about it a lot in chapter 3, just about how there was full on cracking parties to crack software and everything. Like, did you ever go to any of those when you were going to like demo scene? The demo, I know the demo scene came
yeah, yeah, yeah,
after it,
yeah.
based off your book, but did you ever go to cracking parties before then?
I mean, there was a bit of an overlap. I think so. The first parties I went to, I think they were titled kind of either just party or copy party. And so the idea was
Hmm.
that, yeah, you'd copy software or crack software together, and then kind of gradually that kind of gave way to a bit more kind of respectable demo parties, which were just more about kind of competing on your programming and technical skills. But definitely so of course those things are pretty intertwined, right? That
Hmm.
there was a pretty solid kind of European and global network for pirating software, right? And so I definitely knew people, say, who had U.S. contacts and who could get them, like the new, I don't know, Electronic Arts, a
Oh
floppy or
wow.
whatever, like earlier than kind of elsewhere. So it was kind of pretty systematized. It was also kind of mostly just for the fun of it. So I think it was kind of frowned upon for people to say make money selling pirated software, like within those circles, basically. So
Hmm.
so uh, so yeah, but also, I mean, I did crack software myself, and I gotta say it was a lot of fun, right? So it did feel kind of connected to beating the game. It was just another way of beating the game where you felt kind of extra smart, basically.
It's a puzzle, pretty much. Like, it's
Yeah,
just trying to figure it out. I could totally see why that was fun and like engaging to do. Um, one of the things in chapter 3 that really kind of resonated with me is that the Commodore 64 wasn't just a tool for art, but more a medium in which art could be displayed, or like the medium which art was made. And I
yeah,
had never really thought of computers in that way. That was, I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, there's a handful of things that like you kind of change my perspective of in the book, and this was one of them, where it's just kind of like it, I never really thought of it that way, as like like whether it's hacking or the demo scene stuff, where like the medium was figuring out what the computer could render at any point in time, and using it to create some form of art, right? And
yeah.
I thought that was a really interesting perspective. I've never really heard anyone think of like, or write it down in that way before. Like, could you just elaborate a little bit more into that? Just like the C64 as a medium.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so also think about say like yeah, through the 80s and up till the 90s. So people don't really have the internet, right? That's not really until like the mid 90s that
Yeah.
regular folks have the internet. And then there were things like kind of BBSs in some places. It wasn't so popular in in most of Europe because you didn't have this like free local calling, which I think was common in many parts of the US. So often in the US, you
Hmm.
might call your local PBS for free, but in most of Europe, it would cost you per minute, right? So, but that just means that there was no, so you couldn't download music off the internet, right? And you couldn't. It
Hmm.
was difficult to download pictures and so on. And so then, but you did actually have a kind of distribution network, which was probably really centered around kind of pirated games in the beginning, right? So you there was a network for somebody had a pirated a game, and then they could copy it to someone else. They could copy it to someone else. So these kind of trading networks. But that
Hmm.
meant that that trading network could be used for all kinds of other stuff, right? So it could be used for like galleries of pictures that people had made. It could be used for distributing music, right? You couldn't get MP3s, but right, you could get a floppy full of Commodore 64 music, right? That somebody would
Hmm.
give to you. And then later, like these kind of demonstration programs, and of course, word processors and so on. And so it was sort of like, yeah, I wouldn't say it was the internet of the day, right? But it was a platform where you could sort of freely distribute all kinds of things, including text and including kind of weird magazines that people had been writing, like this idea of the disc magazine and so on.
Yeah.
So it was the kind of universal platform for stuff for media that you could to distribute, right? Also because there just were these trading networks. So that was
Hmm.
good times, right? Of course, then you had access to a lot of stuff that was just very difficult to get hold of in any other way, right?
That's so interesting, man. Like I just like I said, I had never really thought about it as a medium, and just you breaking it down like that, where it was done for music and obviously visual and art, and so like, it's really really cool, really interesting. Also, the other thing from chapter 3 that blew my mind: DreamHack started out as like a demo scene event.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's
Yeah, yeah. So
that's
there
just
was
wild.
yeah. So there was a thing that happened, like what we now call the LAN party, right? So
Hmm.
in Commodore 64 times, you didn't have a LAN, right? You didn't actually have a local network. It wasn't a thing, right? So definitely like these kind of meetups where you would kind of give software to each other or music, whatever, on floppy disks, then gradually kind of became the LAN party once you started having, say, like Doom in the early 1990s, and those then the kind of demo scene events, and a lot of them then gradually had a larger and larger focus on games, and then eventually like a lot of the demo scene stuff usually kind of disappeared, right? Because they're just kind of more kind of gamers than they are kind of demo scene programmers, right? So there was a people also feel a bit of a kind of nostalgia for that being kind of lost, right?
Mm, mm. That's something else that that's something else that I found really interesting about that separation between like as the demo scene events continued on, how they would some would turn into LAN parties and others would be like, no, this should be strictly for demos, like the the oh my gosh, the little like presentation type of things that they would make for each one. And I guess that, just for my listeners, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jesper, but like for demos in a demo scene event, it was basically just showing off like almost screensavers. It makes it sound very like insulting. I don't mean it that way at all, but it's like visual tricks and stuff like that, like where it's not meant to be like a game or a movie, but you might have some animation in it. It's kind of just like a little, it's a demo of some crazy technical stuff that they were able to pull off with it. Am I kind of correct with that, where it's, once again, screensaver makes it sound really like insulting. I don't mean it that way, but that's the only way I can kind of that's the only words coming to mind right now.
Yeah, yeah, no, but I think that's correct. So the history of it is a bit right that there were these things called demos. There's this kind of very famous Commodore 64 Christmas demo from Commodore, which showed off
Mm,
that you could play music and you could have a Christmas tree and so on. And then also like when people were cracking software, and I think this is the generally accepted kind of version of this is that if you remove the copy protection from a piece of from a game, then you typically add an intro. So you'd have a logo and your the name of your cracking group and some text, right? And then those intros sort of became more and more complex and became standalone kind of things where people would then kind of compete in doing various tricks. So an obvious trick might be, so the Commodore 64 has these kind of sprites, or these
mm,
movable objects for games. And then an obvious kind of competition might be to be the one with the most kind of sprites, the most moving objects on the screen at a time. And then there were various other tricks. One thing that was pretty central was this idea that if people can see the Commodore 64 screen before their eyes. Then it's a kind of dark blue background and a light blue border. And then it turned out that you could do this kind of trick where you trick the video chip to forgetting to draw the border, and then you could actually show kind of sprites or graphics like in the border of the television screen, which you
Hmm.
had been kind of trained to assume couldn't happen, right? So that was kind of shocking. And then you had all these competitions for like how many sprites can you move while also showing stuff in the border, and how many colors can you have, and so on. And so that was it was kind of a combination of this like just doing kind of pure technical stuff and having good music and having good graphics. It's still going on to this day. I was at a Commodore 64 demo party last year, but there were a few. There are a few all the time actually. So it's sort of a subculture, which I think lived a lot on this fact that you've been so used to looking at all these games and looking at the Commodore 64 screen that you had a clear idea of what was possible, and then when somebody could do a technical trick, just making something that you kind of didn't expect to be possible, that was kind of a shock. And of course, that gave a lot of credit, but it was also people just also enjoyed the fact that the Commodore 64 did this. Like it's a bit like when we talked about it with the Switch, right? So that it was that people wanted to see these tricks, right? Because it gave them the feeling that the Commodore 64 could just continue to develop. You could always find new tricks. It could do kind of ever more things than you didn't think it could do, right? So it created this feeling, this imaginary, right, that the Commodore 64 could just kind of keep going forever and kind of have new tricks and do new things that you didn't think it could do.
Hmm.
And then, of course, it was also competition, right? So it was also friendly, mostly friendly competition with other kind of groups, right? So where you always wanted to be the ones who did like one particular trick like before everybody else or in a slightly better way than everybody else. And then all of these demos, people can see them online. So all of these demos were that full of these kind of texts where people would kind of boast or they would say hi to all of the friends in the other groups and so on. It should also be said that these we had kind of pseudonyms or handles, right? So nobody were going by their real name. So my name was TCD, the cracking Dane, back in the day, which I thought was really cool when I was whatever 16 or 17. Uh, and so that was kind of part of it, right? So you did feel awesome, right? And you did feel like you were part of a kind of culture that just was doing what nobody else was doing, and to some extent also what nobody else really understood. I think, which was kind of part of the enjoyment of it, right? So I do talk about going to these demo parties and like the deadline for the demos getting postponed to the point where the actual event is actually at 2 a.m.
Oh,
where
jeez.
people are then showing off the demos at that point, kind of tired, right? And then having to
Hmm.
vote on the best demos and so on. But that was part of it. And then you slept in sleeping bags in these kind of gyms and so on. So that was a good times.
One of the things you just mentioned a little bit ago, where you were talking about getting rid of the border on the Commodore 64, that was that was kind of like the inflection, whatever point, the
Yeah.
kicking off point of this like demo scene, and people realizing that this computer could do way more than it was originally intended for. I one of the things I found really enjoyable is when I don't know if it was you or at one of the like the Commodore like events where they spoke with the original designer of the system and showed him that you could like get rid of the border, and he was just blown away by that.
Yeah, no, it was funny because I had interviewed him and I actually assumed that he would know, and then this other guy Johan Grip had showed these demos to him, and he was really surprised. And
Mm.
so Johan Grip talks about that he explains the trick of removing the border, and then El Chabinchit says, "But why would you do that? It wouldn't show anything." And then he thinks, "Oh, right, it would show the sprites." And he just realizes, just after 40 years, like that it would actually work, right? But he just hadn't seen it. He hadn't been involved in the scene at all. Yeah, that was pretty interesting, right? And I think it was also interesting that, I mean, you could imagine some, say, chip designers who would feel I know, so offended by the fact that you used their chips in just to these really weird ways, but he was totally fine with it. He thought it was great. He had no problems with it whatsoever, right? But I think that's also, I think he also understood this idea that if you want say like people to keep creating new things, you should also just give them pretty free reign, right? So that's also
Hmm.
one of the things I mentioned in the book, that like if you have a Commodore 64 and you turn it on, and then you can do a command, you type poke 1, 0, that crashes the machine, and then you have to
Huh.
turn it off and on again. Right? And today you kind of expect that you cannot crash your computer. It's not supposed to be possible, right? But I think that
Hmm.
when you have on an old machine like this, that was kind of your problem, right? If you crash the computer, you just shouldn't do it, right? And that also meant that they were just more, they weren't terribly worried about people, I don't know, doing, you might say, making off-label uses of a chip or something. That was just
Hmm.
perfectly fine. It was up to you, right? So I think that's also, I think, what's kind of nice about these kind of old platforms.
I feel like that that border trick is just such a perfect example of everything you're talking about between chapter 1 and 3, where chapter 1 is as intended, that's the border, and chapter 3 is against intentions, and that's removing the border. uh, I loved that example to kind of illustrate the difference between those two imaginaries.
Yeah.
um, Now, moving on to, I'm going to actually skip over chapter 4. Do we have time? We got a little bit of time. With chapter 4, I also love just seeing the screenshots and examples of all the different, like essentially GUI windows that people were able to add between GEOS and or GOS and what was the second one? There was one that came out a little bit later that was like allowed clicking like draggable windows and stuff like that.
But there's one in Final Cartridge, so
That's what it was.
which is kind of weird because it's not useful. It doesn't change your regular use of the machine. It's just sort of like before you kind of really used the machine, there were these windows you could drag around. So it was definitely this kind of very kind of superficial sales pitch. Now your
Hmm.
Commodore 64 has Windows, but you couldn't actually really use it for anything. You could kind of move the calculator around a bit, right? And that was it, right? Yeah.
Oh, that's funny.
And even before that, like just very early on, Commodore had done something called Magic Disk. Is it 1983? Which is sort of like it's kind of it looks a bit like a graphical interface, but it's meant to. It looks like you kind of have an office with kind of file drawers and so on, and then it's kind of just an interface for, say, like a word processor and a database and so on. So that was definitely like and people were toying with these kind of graphical user interfaces at that
Hmm.
time, right?
What I wanted to kind of like I want to go into the last portion of the book, and I only had there was one note that I took down, and I've mentioned it a handful of times while we were recording about like certain things that really jumped out at me and really made me think of things in a different way. And the one thing I actually wrote it down. I'll add some more context to it for the listeners, but there's a sentence in your book in chapter 5 where it goes, difficulty is an aesthetic choice, a choice about what we find interesting. And
Yeah,
I had never so I went to school for game design. I only have an associate's degree. I don't consider myself any way, shape, or form like an expert or intelligent about making game design choices. I'm not trying to say that, but I studying it then, and I had never, my teacher had never explained to me difficulty in that way. And you're not applying that sentence just to video games, of course. You're also applying it to uh, why Commodore 64 just seems to be ever enduring. Like you just saying, like a year or two ago, there was another demo scene event. Like it's still happening, it's still going on, even all these years later. Um, and to add context for my listeners, what in the book, when you're talking about difficulty is an aesthetic choice, where it's almost like what parts of the Commodore 64 do the users now find interesting? And you reference,
yeah,
a musician, and you also reference an artist who uses the Commodore 64 to like for art, like actual like using it and then taking that art and turning it into like cross stitch and stuff like that. And I the one part that you reference is that when people make new things for these demo scenes, they're not making them on the Commodore 64. They're using the limitations of the Commodore, but they're actually coding them in something that's much more efficient. And that kind of ties into difficulty being an aesthetic choice about
Yeah,
like what are they choosing to stay difficult? Like what parts of this still remains essential? Like, are you still programming for a Commodore even if you're not using the Commodore for programming? And so
yeah,
they're choosing the difficulty of the limitations of the Commodore 64, but and that's the aesthetic, but they are choosing to code that on much more powerful machines so they don't have to wait forever just to boot up the system or program or load a program into memory or stuff like that. Like i I
yeah.
don't really have too much of a question on this. It's more or less I just really like this. And if you have anything to elaborate further on this idea of difficulty being an aesthetic choice, I'd really love to hear it. It was one of my favorite parts of the book.
Yeah, no, but it is a thing, right? If you're making things on the original machine with the floppy drive and so on, there are lots of things that are kind of difficult, right? So one is just sort of grokking the machine or figuring out a good way of layouting the memory so you can
Hmm.
perform a specific trick and so on. And that's super interesting. But there's also other kinds of difficulty. One is just like, can you fit the whole thing on a floppy? Can you do you need to like juggle different floppies and copy between different floppy drives to actually have things working? Do you need to wait for the thing to kind of build, etc.? If you have to pre-calculate something, do you also have to wait for the Commodore 64 because it's kind of slow, at least by now, right? And all these other parts kind of was decided not to be that interesting. I mean, there are some people that still program on the machine itself, but most people have switched to using, say, like a modern computer with a better keyboard and
Hmm.
source control and version control and all this kind of stuff, right? And that's just I don't think it doesn't seem nobody thinks this is a problem, right? I, if some people are making programs for a slightly modified version of the Commodore 64, there's a kind of discussion like, does this really count or what doesn't it? But nobody is kind of questioning the use of obviously like a kind of a modern PC for doing the kind of pre-calculation and compilation and running it in a emulator and so on. And yeah, so that's the idea of this the aesthetic choice, right? That there're just some things that some of the difficulty we really wanted, and some of it we just kind of wanted to get rid of, apparently.
And to kind of bring that to over to the video game side of things, like
Oh,
one of the
okay.
things.
Just one thing, which is that
Oh yeah, yeah.
I think you could just see you can see it sometimes on when people put on videos on YouTube, right? That sometimes people will like emphasize this was recorded on a real Commodore 64, right? So then you have a bit of that thing that people certainly like this idea of running the program on the real hardware, right? So
Hmm.
even though it may not look super different on YouTube, right? Whether it's just recorded from an emulator with a filter or if it's from the real thing, right? Then people still like this idea that there's a connection to the original sort of physical hardware,
Hmm.
not just not when you're programming.
No, and I totally get that. Like I'm a game collector, and even though I could get like a ROM totally legally of some whatever game, I like having the physical thing on the original hardware just because it
Yeah,
it just feels more authentic. But like I can't quantify why that does. It just does. Um, it just feels more natural, I guess. I don't know, but like with to the reason that sentence, difficulty is an aesthetic choice, really resonated with me was that I started thinking about a conversation that I was not a part of, but a friend of the show. I've referenced this episode from him a while ago. Dave Jackson from the Tales from the Backlog podcast talks about like, do games have to be fun? And
mm,
he's talking about the idea of like not everything is going to be fun in a game, and that's actually always that can be a good thing if it's designed well. And it I was having a hard time, like, how do you
yeah,
pinpoint when something is not fun but it's a good choice to have? And it's the difficult, and I think your sentence there complements that perfectly.
yeah,
Difficulty
yeah,
is an aesthetic choice. Just because something is difficult that itself, like the act of it itself, isn't the like the mechanic of whatever game mechanic you're using. It's enjoyable enough that like you don't mind the difficulty making it not fun, because you enjoy certain aspects of the game to that complement it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then some kinds of difficulty you enjoy, and then it even seems that there's some kinds of boredom that people enjoy. I think
Hmm.
I think that happened a lot with the, you might call the RPGification of games, right? That today, well, a lot of games have some kind of experience point kind of system where you get upgrades over time and so on, right? Um,
Hmm.
and that means that even when you're doing something that's kind of mind-numbingly dull, you're still feeling like you're doing something that's kind of functionally important in the bigger picture, right?
Yeah.
You're grinding, you're working towards some kind of upgrade and so on. So I think that's, you might say, that's kind of one variation of that, not of the difficulty, but at least of things that are kind of not fun, which are kind of fun, or at least kind of meaningful still, because it's part of like a bigger kind of picture.
Well, and speaking of fun, you know what's been too much fun? The Commodore 64 and the title of your book, Too Much Fun. And before we go, Jesper, before I ask my final questions, this is a gaming podcast after all. So are there any games you'd like to highlight from the Commodore 64, or games just in general you'd want to talk about on the system?
Yeah, so I think especially the early history of the machine had these kind of really kind of interesting games from Epic. So there's one game called the Summer Games, which was like this kind of Olympic
Hmm.
style game that I think everybody loved, because at this time it was kind of had kind of amazingly detailed graphics and amazing animations. And also it was this kind of, I think, one of the first games I tried, at least, where you could like compete in like many different sports, right? You could do like
Hmm.
kind of diving and kind of 100-meter dash and so on. It had a bit of this kind of track and field feel to it, but just kind of a bit more kind of elaborate and sort of designed for playing in the home. Like they realized that, like, unlike the arcade, you actually had like all the time in the world, right? So you could play a very long game at home, unlike you could do in the arcades. And then I think there
Hmm.
was a few interesting games also at that time which started playing samples, like sound samples, which the Commodore 64 wasn't really designed to do. There's a game called Impossible Mission, which has this sound sample which says like, "Destroy him, my robots," and I think everybody thought that was like the most amazing thing at the time. And another game I think is super interesting is this game. There's this whole Monty series of these kind of UK games. And Monty on the Run is the one which has the kind of most famous music by this composer Rob Hubbard. But then around that time, there's also a kind of whole sort of action adventure platformer tradition in Europe, say from 1983 to 1990, and
Hmm.
which is interesting because that actually predates, say, Super Mario Brothers, right? So there were like all these action adventure platformers with exploration in Europe, like around 1983, prior to them being on other platforms, as far as I can tell, or I would argue anyway, right? And I think
Hmm.
those are often tied to the fact that the hardware of the Commodore 64 has this kind of scrolling, right? It was easy or fairly simple to make a character that moves around a kind of larger world, right?
Hmm.
And that also led to a game like SimCity, right? So Will Wright talks about when he did his first game on the Commodore 64, Raid on Bungling Bay, he wanted to do something you could only do on the Commodore 64. And therefore, he made a game where you just kind of flew a helicopter around this larger map. And then that game became SimCity eventually, which was first
Hmm.
developed for the Commodore 64. So in that way, you can see that even like a long running series like SimCity actually grew out of some specific kind of hardware decisions on the Commodore 64, because they wanted to make a computer, a device that allowed you to play in these kind of larger worlds, right?
Hmm.
Some other games which are interesting, like there's also like a late game like the one called Turrican, a German game, which is this kind of action. again, like it's called an action platformer where you can fly and move around quickly and so on. So towards the end of the Commodore 64's kind of commercial life, just in the early 90s, people really knew how to use the machine. So they could really make these kind of very, really amazing games with lots of action and movement and kind of really beautiful graphics and sound. So it was also kind of interesting towards the end of the machine's kind of commercial life to see all the things that people had figured out how to do with it in games.
I really want to get my. I mean, I don't own a Commodore 64, but I really want to try some of these out
Oh yeah,
at some point. Just because, I mean, there's emulators online, so I'm sure I should try some of these out. But I remember reading that in the book, like learning that like SimCity originated. I mean, basically was designed for the Commodore 64,
yeah,
which I had no idea. That's really interesting, and I think just touching on all these games and really like it really gets me thinking just about how and it's a main point of your book too, but just like how overlooked this system and computer really was. Like one point we didn't bring up during the episode, at least not that I remember, was just it's the best selling like computer of this era
yeah,
of the 80s, and it's the only computer, as you said in the book, that had success both in North America and in Europe. Very few things had crossover, uh and this was one of the only ones. Like even in home consoles there really wasn't a lot of crossover. You know,
yeah,
Nintendo and NES was big in North America, and then the Sega Master System was big over in Europe.
yeah,
um and so it's just interesting that like this thing consistently gets overlooked like in game history,
yeah,
despite the
yeah, yeah.
fact that
But also,
all the metrics.
yeah, 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 and even yeah, both by kind of number of machines sold and by the size of the game catalog and so on. Yeah, it is very strange, but I mean, I think in sort of like retro gamer culture, of course, it's a very big platform, but it's just sort of when people sit down and write these kind of big histories, then they kind of often forget it, right? Yeah, and I hope to have moved a small step towards remedying that problem.
I definitely think you have. And one of my favorite things to do on the show is talk about aspects of game history that aren't really focused on all that much. Like, yeah, of course, I love Nintendo like most Americans do, and a lot of people do. But like, I personally find it really interesting when I get to talk about this type of stuff, and specifically, like, that's why when I got contacted by MIT Press for a review copy and to set up this interview with you, I was really excited because this is an area of game history that just I don't know much about. So not only is it something for hopefully my listeners will find interesting and it'll like shed more light on this kind of area that doesn't get talked about enough, but for myself on a selfish level, I really enjoyed getting to learn more about the Commodore 64 through your book and through this interview.
Great.
Were there any other games that you wanted to talk about before we go into the final questions?
No, I think that's good for now.
All right. I think that's a good place that we can start wrapping up this episode, actually, Jesper. So I really appreciate you setting aside the time for this conversation. I really enjoyed talking about your book. And there's honestly more stuff I would want to go into specifics, but I don't want to spoil too many things for people who have not read the book yet, because there's a lot of stuff obviously did not touch on that is in your book. There's a lot of great like details about just especially the demo scene. There's so many crazy interesting demo scene stories that I really enjoyed. So I'm really grateful I got to read it and got to speak to you for this conversation. To be a little corny, has been too much fun. uh,
Thank you. No, it's been an enjoyable conversation too. And I should say that yeah, the book has many more stories. It also has color pictures.
It does. It's a lot. I love seeing all. And actually, there's. Sorry, I jumping all over the place. There's also references back to your website where there is a Commodore 64 emulator and
Yeah,
like little demos that you can see some of the examples from the book on your website. Correct?
that's correct. And also there's also like some of these kind of early Commodore ads and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
and videos from games and demos and so on. So yeah, that's the idea to have a kind of good collection of those things on the website.
So yeah, I definitely recommend this book to everyone. But before we go, Jesper, I have a couple final questions for you. I
Sure.
end all my interviews with these types of questions. One is from I'm a huge fan of the Alan Alda podcast, Clear and Vivid, where it's all about communication, and he always ends his episodes with 7 questions. I'm not going to ask all 7 questions,
Mhm.
but I like his questions because they're just kind of they're good conversation pieces. So I'm only going to take one, and I like this one a lot, and I think I'm going to use it for this one. So, what book changed your life?
Oh. um, are there kind of constraints? Does it have to be fiction or nonfiction?
It doesn't, no constraints needed. It could be fiction, it could be nonfiction. Any, the first book that I mean, it maybe it doesn't have to be like because I know that
Sure.
could
All right.
it
All
could be
right.
a
All
lot.
right.
But if you have something that pops into your head, go for it.
All right. So I'm gonna go with the music of chance by Paul Auster,
Okay.
because I mean that was like he yeah, Paul Auster died recently, and that was just sort of kind of very strong book about how life can be full of these kind of weird coincidences and random occurrences, and then
Hmm.
still feel in some way like it had to happen the way it did, which is super weird. Like this is a feeling of kind of destiny. You might say that something random happens, and that it still feels like that is the way it had to happen. And that to me is always a kind of weird kind of duality. So it's a good book for thinking about kind of life and randomness and chance.
And it's the music of chance,
Yeah,
correct?
that's correct.
Okay, cool. I just want to make sure I got that. That's interesting. I love hearing all these random like book recommendations when I ask people this because it's I get a different one each time. It's super interesting. Um, all right, my final question for you is a question from Courtney. Da 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 da. Questions from Courtney. Courtney is my wife, and as listeners know, she famously knows nothing about video games, video game history, geek culture, or any of that. So I always ask her for a question, just whatever pops into her mind to ask my guest. She doesn't even know who my guests are 99% of the time.
Okay.
Makes that much more interesting. So she had this one. If you could pick one decade to repeat itself, which would it be?
The 1990s.
The 1990s. Any particular reason why you would love to see the 90s not just come back, but full on repeat?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you ask me like this, it's just because I felt culturally the 1980s were a bit stifling. I had a lot of fun with computers, right? But there was, I think, a sense that you couldn't do too many weird things, and I think the 90s to me kind of opened up things that it was kind of
Mm,
okay to do. I mean, you had kind of grunge or kind of techno music. You could do all kinds of new things that felt kind of different than before. And then also I think this is also where I think to me kind of computer culture kind of broke through a little, like with things like kind of multimedia, and it became much
hmm.
easier to show kind of what computers could do, and you started having the internet. So I think that was like the decade that was way much more interesting after the 1980s.
You know what? You mentioning multimedia reminds me just to kind of bring it all full circle. Would you say the Commodore 64 is one of the earliest examples of a multimedia computer? Because it's, I understand the craze came about in the 90s, but if you think about it, you know, the Commodore could play music and do graphics, which, like you mentioned before, not all home computers, or sorry, computers for the home, were necessarily meant to do. Would you consider it one of the earliest examples?
It's a good question. I think so. Jimmy Mayer, in his book "The Future Was Here" about the Commodore Amiga, I think he's, if I recall correctly, he does make this argument about the Amiga being like the first kind of multimedia computer. I do definitely think that the Commodore 64 were at least kind of had the early the early seeds for that, right? The fact of a computer that that could have kind of colorful graphics and pictures and music, and you could kind of distribute it. It's on not on CD-ROMs, but on floppy disks. But it was definitely, I think, the beginning of that, right? And also not only in a kind of technical sense, but also as a kind of culture where you could share things with each other like we do today.
Mm. That just, I don't know, that just really gets me thinking. I'll have to check out that book then, just to kind of explore a little bit more of that as well. Um, but yeah, I think that's all I have for you, Jesper. This was actually a little bit shorter than I was planning on it, but it's all right. I want to make sure I didn't give too much away of your book. That's the
Okay.
primary focus. I
Yeah,
want my
yeah.
listeners to go out and check this book out. So I really appreciate you setting aside some time for me for this. Where can the good people find you online? And obviously, you want to promote the book, but anything you like to promote, book, anything or otherwise.
Yeah, sure. I think the book's website is at my name, like Jesper Juul, JesperJuul.net/C64. And like on that website, it's both the kind of the examples from the book, and you can find some of my other writings as well. And there's also links to my, say, my Twitter and Blue Sky profiles.
All right. And as usual, for myself, you can follow me on Facebook. I'm off of Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram, at Still Loading Pod on all those locations. I stream every Tuesday and Thursday night around 8 p.m. Eastern. Saturday, not Tuesday and Thursday. I'm losing my mind. I stream every Saturday around 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. On Tuesdays, I'm over at my buddy Andrew's Twitch channel at the EXP point for our Talk Tuesdays, which is every Tuesday we just kind of catch up. It's like a little mini talk show that him and I just kind of share what we've experienced throughout the week. And then if I'm feeling up to it, I stream on my own channel after that. So you can always check out all those things. If you want to support the show, you can do so in a number of ways. You can give it a 5-star rating or review on whichever podcasting app you use. It helps more people find the show, and it pleases the algorithm gods, and hopefully it makes me feel warm and fuzzy. And I like feeling warm and fuzzy. You can also support the show over at patreon.com/stillloadingpod. For $1 a month, you get all the episodes like this one a little bit earlier with better audio quality, as well as access to patron voting rights, which help guide the direction of the show. Coming up actually in a couple weeks, because this will be out in December. In a couple of weeks, at the beginning of January, is going to be my backlog month poll, where I'll have 16 games from my backlog up for grabs, and the 4 games that get the most votes from my patrons will be chosen for backlog month later that year. So if you would like to help guide the direction of the show, you can go over to patreon.com/stillloadingpod, and just for as little as $1 a month, you can do all that. There's a bunch of other tiers though, and I won't go through all of them, but there is a $3 one where you get shout outs at the beginning of the episode, like you heard at the beginning of this one. There's also a $5 tier where I have bonus episodes and access to my monthly movie podcast, which, if I get my act together by the time this comes out, I should be starting Still Family, my monthly Fast and Furious movie podcast, where all the guests who join me aren't just friends, they're family. So that will do it. That's all I got. That's all my plugs. So that will do it for this episode of Still Loading. Thank you all so much for listening. Jesper, thank you once again for joining me.
Thank you, Josh.
And with all that said, listeners, I will see you all next time.